Hi, everybody. Thanks for being with us today. This is Tim Anderson, the appraiser's advocate, and this is Movers and Shakers today again with Craig Morley. Now, this is a continuation of what Craig and I were talking about the last time we got together. We didn't get to finish up many of the topics we wanted to cover. So we're going to cover them again today. Craig, again, let me thank you for being with us. It's good to see you again, even though it's just via TV.
Well, it's always nice to spend time with you, Tim. I'm a little casual today, but hey, we're sequestered, so I'm not going to see anybody in real life, and so we are always happy to spend a little time virtually.
And just to remind everybody, today is your 21st birthday, isn't it?
It is
Yeah,
again,
yeah, again.
the third time.
Okay, all right. Well, happy birthday. Well, Craig, the last time we spoke, we had talked about the concept of highest and best use, and that tended to be an area of apprehension, miscomprehension, confusion when it comes to the typical residential real estate appraisal. Now, you look at that not only as a state certified general real estate appraiser, but you also look at it from a standpoint of not only the people with whom you work and whom you supervise, but also as a former member and a former chair of the Utah State Board. So, okay, you got your Utah State Board appraisal board member hat on, and an appraisal comes in and it says, yep, highest and best uses, whatever it is, it's there. And that's all it says. Now, how much trouble, if any at all, is that appraiser going to find him or herself? And more importantly, why?
Well, usually, my experience with state investigators is that if the improvements are in fact the highest and best use, and there aren't issues, it's unlikely that someone is going to, number one, file the complaint because they checked the box without doing as USPAP requires in summarizing the summarizing their highest and best use analysis. But what it is it's kind of like we used to see with seatbelts. You know, you get pulled over because you got a tail light out and you don't have your seatbelt on, and they go, "Oh, by the way, we're going to cite you for the tail light and for the seatbelt." And that's oftentimes what we'll see is somebody's unhappy with the value that you developed, and a complaint gets filed, and they go, "Well, look at this. This guy forgot to summarize highest and best use as required." And so it certainly is an issue if you have an appraisal that gets sent into an investigative board where they might list that as one of the deficiencies of the appraisal. And so it's something that, as a general rule, appraisers have not done a very good job when they're using a residential form in providing the standard two requirements of summarizing your highest and best use analysis.
So the issue, I like the seatbelt analogy. That was very good. Thank you. So the issue is the not the value. The consumer writes to the state, "Oh, I didn't get my value and I couldn't get enough equity, so I didn't get to buy my boat. Therefore, the appraiser's an idiot." And here's the complaint. Now, very well, the appraiser may be an idiot, but that's not the issue. And we both know, we've spoken about this before, that the instructions from the Appraisal Foundation are board, the value is irrelevant. Don't look at that. Look at everything else. So the appraisal board is looking at the appraisal, and the investigator goes, "Oh, well, okay, the highest and best use box is marked. Okay, that's fine, but there's no summary of the highest and best use." So what you're saying is then that way too often you got a check box and nothing else. So what's an appraiser supposed to do?
Well, and I think sometimes we fail to realize is that appraisers make their reports USPAP compliant, and it's not the person who develops the form to do that. And so if there's not room on the form or in the little section after the little checkbox to provide appropriate analysis, you need to, and I think it's always nice to lead your client to where you provided that analysis within the report. So maybe you say, look on page 3 or look in the addendum for the complete highest and best use analysis, and then you go through the elements that talk about the physically possible, legally permissible, financially feasible, and the productive use of the property, so that you can help your client understand the situation with this property. And most of the time, it's not a big deal. But as you well know, and we've seen a few cities that have gone in and made some changes to their zoning,
You can
where
say Minneapolis. That's okay, because it's true. That's public
Minneapolis has been a
record. We're
popular,
yeah, we're not
yeah,
hiding anything when we say Minneapolis. Yeah.
yeah, well, and so, and I don't remember how many appraisals that had been flagged for review, but it was over 100, and what was it, 3 that had adequate highest and best use analysis out of well over 100 appraisals.
Yeah, so we're talking about less than 3%. And that's, basically probably what you'd find in just random chance. So I think it's safe to say that, at least in Minneapolis anyway, the state appraisal authorities are finding that appraisers are not complying with the USPAP requirements to form an opinion, state it, and then indicate a summary of why and how you formed that opinion.
Yeah, and I think where we oftentimes run into problems is the majority of the time, the residential property that we're appraising is consistent with the highest and best use. The problem we run into is when they're not, or when there's issues. For example, it's not uncommon. In fact, I was talking to a state investigator a week or two ago where an appraiser had accepted an appraisal assignment. The property is in a commercial zone. It's a multi-level structure. The main floor is an office. The second floor has an apartment or a house or something up there with a large part of that section of the property that's vacant. It's not improved. And they completed this assignment on a 1004 residential appraisal report form. Now, the question is if I'm a certified residential appraiser, can I even accept that assignment? And how can I determine what the highest and best use of that property is without having the practical experience to be able to analyze, is this really a residential property from a highest and best use standpoint? And will my state licensing authority even allow me to do this appraisal? And so this appraiser, I don't know what's going to happen, but this appraiser's got themselves in a jam.
The jam being the improper analysis of the property and a residential appraiser doing a commercial assignment. Is that basically what you mean, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, ultimately, because they're a residential appraiser, it's a residential property. So I'm going to ignore the office on the main floor and try to appraise this thing as a house, is what ended up happening. And obviously, in even accepting the assignment, there has to be some kind of highest and best use to determine, is this an assignment I can even accept? And I think a lot of times we get so used to clicking that little box that we fail to realize that the highest and best use analysis is what drives everything else we do from the appraisal standpoint. What approaches the value I'm going to develop, how I'm going to report my assignment results, all of that is based on that highest and best use decision. And if I'm not a certified general appraiser, it might even determine whether or not I can even accept the assignment.
Now, Craig, you're familiar with educational requirements given your service to the state. And I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, that's not the point, but do you think that qualifying appraisal education, QE education, properly instructs, properly teaches, properly properly introduces the concept of highest and best use to the fledgling real estate appraiser?
My experience has been is that the problem that I see with education is that it doesn't get put into application nearly as well as it should be. It's too frequently, people kind of know the Sunday school answer, but when it comes to actually applying these things to the situations they find themselves in is the problem. And so it seems to me like we ought to have more case study analysis so that we take the theoretical concepts associated with highest and best use and put it into application. And so I guess the answer is I don't think we have enough practical illustrations in the QE to help appraisers understand what ought to happen. And I suspect the other problem we have is appraisers who are starting down that educational course don't have enough practical experience to understand why highest and best use is even an issue.
Okay, let's. We're going to come back to that. All right, let's take a look at the potential incongruities there are in highest and best use. Now, if you open the 14th edition of the Appraisal of Real Estate, which some people consider to be the definitive text on real estate appraisal, there is a 4-step process: physically possible, legally permissible, financially feasible, and then of the financially feasible uses, that one use that brings the highest value. Then there is USPAP, which basically has a 5-step model that incorporates essentially all of the 4-step model, but apparently takes it even further. And then there's Fannie Mae's highest and best use model that basically says once you've shown the improvements add at least $1 net to the value of the underlying site, you can stop, because you just proved the improvements are indeed the highest and best use of the site, and it would not be financially feasible to tear them down and start all over again. So is the fact that we've got conflicting models of highest and best use, and we don't really quite know which one we're supposed to follow, is that a problem we need to worry about?
Well, it can be if you're sitting in front of the appraisal board and they pick the one you haven't done and think that you did it wrong. That's where you're, that's where I think you run into the real problem. My experience has been, if you make even a reasonable attempt to analyze highest and best use, other than just check the box, you've at least probably gotten yourself to a situation where you're not going to be in too much trouble unless you've done it wrong. And where I oftentimes see people getting it wrong is that they don't understand some of the basic elements, like what is the difference between excess land and surplus land, and how does that affect my valuation method in dealing with that issue when it arises. And you get into some of these rural areas or some of these other situations, and it's a problem. I mean, it's a situation that you encounter, and if you don't do it properly, it's a problem.
Now, what is the appraiser supposed to do from a USPAP compliance standpoint when the appraiser gets back to the client and says, "Hey, you've got some surplus land here," or excuse me, I'm sorry, you've got some excess land here that's going to have to be valued separately because it has its own highest and best use. And the client says, "Oh, yeah, don't worry about it. Just put it in there, and we'll worry about that later. You don't need to worry about that. You don't need to analyze the market that deeply," which is quite common, as a matter of fact. So, from a USPAP compliance standpoint, from an ethics standpoint, what is the appraiser supposed to do when the client gives the appraiser instructions that if the appraiser chooses to follow them, are in blatant disregard / violation of USPAP?
Well, if it's a blatant disregard, I mean, if you're asking to do something that is in direct conflict with USPAP, and especially if it's an appraisal management company who's asking you to do it, your state may have, and several of the states I work in, if I have an AMC that's asking me definitively to violate USPAP, that's a violation of their licensing requirements for the state, and could result in a penalty for them if they ask you to do it. So the first thing I want to do is get it in writing. Send me an email explaining to me what you want me to do, because I want it in my work file. And then secondly so are you asking me to perform a hypothetical appraisal? And if if it's going to a GSE is no, it's not. They can't use a hypothetical appraisal. So are you asking me to violate USPAP because we have two separate highest and best uses here? Well, no, we're not asking for that. Well, then what do you want me to do? And realistically, if you think it's a problem, turn it down. You know, everybody encounters situations where you're asked to do things that your standards don't allow you to do, turn them down. But a lot of times we get into the gray areas where you're in a rural area, you've got multiple parcels that have kind of been assembled together into a single site, and you've got to go in and try to determine is this excess land or surplus land. And I've seen a lot of situations where the reality is just because I have multiple parcels doesn't necessarily mean that it's excess land. And by the way, excess land, and this is always confusing for people, excess land is the one where it's excess. I don't need it to support the existing improvements. And it has its own highest and best use. And if I am including this property as part of the appraisal, the valuation method for that is different than if I am appraising this as surplus land, where it's more land than I need to support the improvements under zoning, but I can't split it off and do anything with it. And so we have to be clear on what the definitional differences are and what the valuation methods are, and make sure that we explain to our client that if I've got excess land, I'm essentially doing two appraisals. I'm doing the appraisal on the property that has the land that supports the existing improvement, and then I'm doing another appraisal on the excess land that has its own individual highest and best use. And so you may want to, if you've got a client that insists you do that, you can do it, but it's a separate, the analysis is completely separate from the primary dwelling usually.
Craig, you and I speak in various places during the year, except this year when we can't travel anywhere. You and I speak to appraisal groups about topics such as this. And both of us have said, guys, look, in this situation, the best thing you can do is probably, if you can't convince your client that there is surplus and or excess land, and if there is excess land, it has to be valued separately. You just really need to walk away from the assignment. And of course, the hand goes up in the back of the room, and the appraiser says, yeah, and then I get taken off the list, and how am I supposed to make a living? Well, from purely an ethical standpoint, that's irrelevant. But from purely a practical standpoint, the bank likes to get its check every month for the mortgage, and so does that silly car company. And I'll be darned if American Express has a real sense of humor if I don't send in a check every month. So what is it? How do we mix the practical and the ethical? How do we reconcile the practical and the ethical?
Well, that's where, I'd mentioned that if you've got particularly an AMC, but any financial organization, and you want to make sure you're right, first of all, but if you are right and they're asking you to do something that's in violation of ethics, that is a violation of Dodd-Frank. It's a violation of most of your state AMC registration or licensing rules. There's nothing wrong with notifying the agency that performs oversight with these companies and explaining to them what the problem is, so that this doesn't become a pervasive situation. I had received an assignment the other day where I didn't know. I knew it was a residential property in the commercial zone. What I didn't know is how many units were, is there more than one unit? And if there are, what's involved with it? And so I wasn't able to really figure out what the property was until I got there. And it turns out to be an old residential property with another old residential dwelling back behind that, with a single wide mobile home back behind that, and in a commercial zone. And in doing the analysis, the improvements probably add value to the land, but not by very much. And so I immediately contact the client and say, listen, this is what you've got. This appraisal doesn't really lend itself very well as a triplex on a residential form, but I can do it. It's just, it's a one-off property, and it's not going to lend itself very well to a secondary market kind of a thing. I don't know if this is a home equity loan. I don't know what you're trying to do here. I just want you to be aware of what this report's going to look like when we're done. And you've got a large percentage of the value is in the land, and the improvements are essentially an interim use where their remaining economic life is pretty short. And so what do you want to do? It's been about 2 weeks. I haven't heard back yet, so I don't know what they want to do. But
maybe that's your answer right there.
Yeah. But I know this thing is not going to fit the mold. Because I'm pretty sure I'm not going to have anything else that is anywhere close to being the same thing. It's generating enough income to where the improvements add some value, but the income stream life is pretty short without some significant renovation. And so it's just we oftentimes will come into these oddball situations, and the highest and best use is a significant part of it. And communicating with our clients to explain things, I think, is probably one of the best ways that you can go about trying to deal with those, so that you don't spend the rest of your life answering questions from an underwriter on an appraisal that they're never going to make a loan on anyway.
Craig, let's talk about what actually goes into reports from the standpoint of highest and best use. Now, there are in the software, there is in the software boilerplate, and the appraiser can put the highest and best use boilerplate into the report. Does that highest and best use boilerplate, as it comes from the pre-printed software, comply with Standard Rule 1-3A and B and Standard Rule 2-2 A12?
My take on it is no. They've got a little bit of language with the little box in front, but I think it is always best practice, and most of the state agencies that regulate appraisers that I've seen indicate that it needs to be summarized. Now, I think you can develop your own boilerplate that goes in and provides a more comprehensive analysis, and maybe you have several to deal with rural properties, or properties where you've got a legal non-conforming use, or properties that have unpermitted additions, or whatever the circumstances may be that you can use. But you really need to have something that expands upon which is pre-printed in the form if you want to avoid running into problems with in a state enforcement agency.
Okay, so all of the things being equal, the pre-printed boilerplate probably doesn't carry any water, right?
Not enough to where I would feel comfortable going before my board and trying to explain the highest and best use in any kind of a meaningful way.
Okay, let's talk some practicality here. Let's take a look at the four components of highest and best use as in the 14th edition. We're not speaking specifically USPAP. We're not speaking specifically Fannie Mae. So the first one is the highest and best use, first of all, must be physically possible. How does an appraiser determine what's physically possible?
Well, if the house is on the lot, it's probably physically possible because it's there. Where I think appraisers run into problems is when you're appraising vacant land. So I've got a client. We see lot appraisals come in fairly frequently. Somebody wants to buy a lot and build a house on it down the road. That now becomes a significant issue. Is it physically possible? Do I have issues with floodplains? Do I have issues with terrain? Do I have issues with soil? Can I actually build something on this property? And how do I determine that? And so physically possible is a significant component to highest and best use, but it more often than not is dealing with the land component when I'm analyzing the land vacant. And if I'm doing the analysis for an improved property, it may not be quite as involved.
Okay, so for simplicity's sake, let's just assume an improved property. So basically, the appraiser says, "Look, reader, look, client, look, intended user. It's obviously physically possible to develop the site because it's developed, and every other lot in the neighborhood is developed. So physical possibility is yes, it can be developed." So we've just answered that component. We did it in about 2 or 3 sentences, and relatively short sentences too. All right, now we've proven, or excuse me, we've supported that it's physically possible to develop the site. Now we get into the legally permissible component of highest and best use. How does an appraiser prove that the existing improvements are legally permissible?
Well, the first of all, and this is where we, I think, as appraisers fail to do what we probably ought to do, is go look at zoning and have some understanding of what the zoning is, because zoning is usually the underlying overlay that tells me, unless I'm in Texas, what what I can legally do with the property. And so once I have an idea of what the legal permissible uses under zoning are, I might have an overlay with a deed restriction or CC&Rs. You know, if I'm in a subdivision that has covenants, conditions, and restrictions, there may be other things. So it's not uncommon for somebody to go in and do some things that weren't permitted by the homeowners association that might require that be put back to its original condition if I haven't received the appropriate approvals. And so where we oftentimes run into some of these problems is I've got a little accessory dwelling unit, or I've got a garage that's been converted, or a patio that's been enclosed. And at that point, I'm needing to check with the city and try to determine if a permit was issued that allows that, and if the what the city's attitude is for some of these things. Some cities, I do some work in Mojave County, Arizona. I mean, it's the Wild West there. Until just recently, you had homes that had been built, the county didn't even know they existed, and they were assessed as vacant land, which when I looked at the assessment records, if there was no improvements and there's a house on the lot, it probably means they didn't get a permit, in which case you're having to condition the appraisal to go fix that, or notify the client that, hey, this house was built without a permit. What do you want to do? You may tell your buyer that, or your borrower, that they're going to have to go through the process. And they had a process of remediation that's possible, but that's an element of risk that your borrower may want to be aware of before they start jumping into making a loan on this property.
So then part of what we do is assess risk. Now, okay, we say, look, as of whatever today's date is, June 8th, 2020, you can build a house on the site. Well, what's the problem? Why do I have to worry about what's going to happen in 5 years? Why is that my problem? And the underwriter looks at us and says, well, it's not your problem. It's our problem. And therefore we're making it your problem. Or actually, really what the underwriter says is, okay, because we're going to have this loan for 5, 10, 30 years, whereas you're out of the appraisal. So we've got to understand risk. So in other words, what we're saying is, when we talk about the soil composition, is it in a flood zone? Is it in heavy traffic? Is land use changing into what? Did they convert the garage into an ADU, legally or illegally? It's a 900 square foot house on a 4-acre lot, which is a ridiculous underutilization of the site based on the density allowed by zoning, etc. What we're doing is saying, okay, client, yeah, this property has value, and here it is, but it also has certain factors, certain risk factors associated with it. Is that what we're also supposed to be telling the client?
Yeah, it really is. And I think one of the situations that we sometimes run into, and it may vary from state to state. A while back, I had talked with some appraisers in Texas, where you get into some of these areas that are rural, and the Texas Appraisal Board was basically taking the position that if you're on a lot or a site that is 50 acres or more, a certified residential appraiser can't do it because their position was that it was a hold on just one second. Okay. Their position was is you needed to be a certified general appraiser because the highest and best use was involved too much land. Now, in many of the states where I work, if I have a site that will allow more than 4 units on the site, I'm not allowed to do the appraisal because under FIREA, for a lending transaction, if I have more than 4 dwelling units or have the capability of providing more than 4 dwelling units, it requires a discounted cash flow or at least a bulk value analysis. And most of the time, your state regulatory agencies say, well, if you've got to do discounted cash flow or some kind of a bulk sell analysis, then it's outside your license. You've got to be a certified general. And so I have to be cautious. If I've got a little house on a large lot and my zoning allows for more than 4 units to be built on that, is this an assignment that that I can accept, and should I accept it? And maybe the bigger problem is the highest and best use for a house on that lot, or is this a land appraisal? And so we've got to be cautious as we look at some of these assignments and try to determine whether or not it's something I should and want to accept, because some of these are pretty complex and require a lot of analysis. And if some poor guy's accepting an assignment to go do this little house for $400, you might be stepping into a landmine.
Okay, I'm glad you said landmine and nothing else. Okay, okay, we've covered we've covered physically possible, we've covered legally permissible. Let me ask a legally permissible question. Can an illegal use, ILLEGAL, can an illegal use be the property's highest and best use?
Well, I guess it depends on what the outcomes are. A lot of areas that I've seen work done where you've got an illegal improvement on the site, you'll contact the city or county and say, hey, this is the situation. What are you guys going to do about it? If they say nothing, then it's been there long enough that it doesn't meet our current zoning, but we're going to allow it to continue. Then yeah, that might be the highest and best use. But most often, if I've got an illegal use and whoever the regulatory agency over the property is says, you're going to have to alter it. And if I have to alter that property to bring it into compliance, then that's probably not going to be the highest and best use, because there's most likely some cost associated with making those alterations, and it might change the highest and best use of the property. So you can't universally say that something is going to apply, but I would suspect in most cases an illegal use is going to require alteration to bring it to its highest and best use.
Okay, thank you. Let's carry on with this. So we've eliminated all the physically impossible uses. We've eliminated all of the legally impermissible uses. So now we're just looking at uses of the property that are physically possible and legally permissible. And the third component, this is probably the most difficult of the components. We get into financial feasibility. Now, let's talk about financial feasibility for a little while. And again, for simplicity's sake, we're assuming an improved site. How does an appraiser excuse me, that's the wrong word. How does an appraiser support the financial feasibility of the current improvements, or given the fact that the subject is already improved, is that even a necessary step in the highest and best use analytical protocol?
Well, I know a lot of appraisers on some of these existing properties resist doing the cost approach. And I do as well. I mean, I don't do the cost approach on every property, but what I have to have in order to make that determination is a pretty good idea of the underlying land value. If I don't understand or know the underlying land value for this property, then it's pretty hard to determine the financial feasibility, because if this property has more value as a vacant site than it does as a residential property. For example, I've got a little 400 or a little 900 square foot home on a large lot, and 400 or 900 square foot homes are going for $150,000. But if I were to just take the land as vacant, if it's worth $200,000, these improvements are probably not financially feasible, because the underlying land is worth more in an alternative use than it is in the current use, at which point I have to make the determination the improvements aren't financially feasible. And we don't run into that very often, but it's not uncommon in some circumstances where I've got commercial zoning or I've got transitional neighborhood changes that are taking place, so that the existing improvements may not be financially feasible, and they may ultimately be a tear down. And that has to be part of the analysis that you're looking at, especially when it's a close call.
Okay, let's back up and take a little bit deeper look at this. What you're saying is, even if you don't do the cost approach, you still got to come up with a value to the underlying site at its highest and best use in order to measure if the improvements add any value to the site over and above the cost of tearing them down. Is that correct?
Yes, and Tim, I think one of the things that we have lost in as many appraisers is that in appraisal theory, the thing that we do in doing valuation is we always start with the land, and then we look at the contributory value of the improvements. And in uh, that's a method I really like using in trying to develop adjustments and trying to figure out how am I going to appraise a property, both residential and commercial, is what's the land worth and how much do the improvements contribute. And if the improvements don't contribute value, by definition, they're not financially feasible. And so in most, if I've got new construction, a lot of homes being built around me, it's not really usually an issue. Where it runs into an issue is where I'm starting to see a transition in a neighborhood, where I'm seeing older homes being tore down and replaced with office space, or I'm seeing older homes that are being renovated and converted into office space, or something else. That becomes a trigger for me to think, I think maybe this neighborhood is transitioning in such a way that residential isn't the financial feasible use for this property. And I may need to take a deeper dive on how I'm going to value these improvements.
So, from a standpoint of analytics, what you're saying is it's going to take more analysis.
Yes, it almost always does. And depending upon what the purpose of the appraisal is for, we may want to think about how we want to approach it, or if it's an assignment that we should even really be accepting.
And I'm not trying to get on thin ice here, and tell me if I do, and we'll move on. But you take the job for $400 and find out after you've gone to look at the property, you found out that, whoops, this isn't going to take me 10 hours to do. This is going to take me a week to do. And well, but I'm not going to take a week to do it because I'm only getting $400. Is that the stance we need to take? Or would we be better off losing the $400 and walking away from it than doing it wrong? Or should we just, do it wrong and play the odds that we're not going to get caught and cash the $400 check as quickly as possible? What should we do?
Well, we see all too many people who take the latter, where they I'm kind of thin on work right now. I'm just going to do it and hope nothing happens. As an illustration, Tim, just to kind of help, that kind of fits along with this, is I get a call from a state regulator who has an assignment where some poor guy has decided to accept and this is a residentially certified appraiser who has accepted an assignment to appraise a proposed RV park out by a national monument on 12 acres that he does on a Fannie Mae land form.
Okay,
And
we need to make it clear that that ain't a residential appraisal. That is as pure commercial as you can get.
So the appraiser does this assignment on a residential land form, puts every sale that they've ever known about in their entire life in the report, like there's 20 land sales, none of which are analyzed properly. I mean, they don't have a clue how to do it. The range in the indicated values from these sales was over $1 million. The range in the land values was wider than the value that they put on it itself. I mean, it was interesting to see, and clearly it was a competency problem. But then there is, in the no highest and best use is done. There is no discussion about financial feasibility. There's no discussion about how much can I rent these units for? How long is it going to take me to fill it up? But the cost approach is just an attachment of the builder's cost summary. He'd added 10% on top of that for developer profit. Says, well, my land value is this, the cost to build it is this, you got to add your 10% on top of it, this is what it's worth. And does that in a letter of transmittal, and then has a bunch of sales on a residential land form. And that's the appraisal. And it's in a rural area, you know, and the poor guy obviously accepted an assignment that was way outside, number one, the license, and number two, out of their competency. And yet they did the appraisal, and whatever they got paid to do that assignment is going to be far less than what they will pay the state for investigating this thing. And so at some point, you have to ask yourself, is the $5,000 fine worth the $400 fee? And my math, you know, this is a highest and best use analysis, I guess. It isn't financially feasible. No, it's not. So why we do these things, I don't know, but it happens far too frequently.
Yeah, and unfortunately it does. Okay, so we've gone through legally permissible. We've kicked out all the legally impermissible uses. We've gone through legally permissible. We've kicked out all the legally impermissible uses. We have looked at all of the uses that are going to either generate an income or avoid a loss. And we've concluded that the present improvements are indeed financially feasible, because it wouldn't make any sense to buy them for their market value, tear down all the horizontal and vertical improvements, redevelop the site, rebuild another house, and then sell it for enough money to make a profit worthy of the risk we're taking. Therefore, the highest and best use of the improved subject is in the present improvements. Now, is that basically how we would summarize highest and best use for the typical improved property within the report itself?
Yeah, I think you can find a clear and concise way to go in and just indicate the improvements are physically possible. They're there. They're financial, or they're legally permissible. They were permitted, and the zoning, you know, whoever it is that issues those permits has allowed it to occur. And, you know, three is that the improvements add value to the land. So I've met the test of financial feasibility, and there's no real major alterations that I need to make to this property to have it either be habitable or functional as a property. We do occasionally run into situations where properties are getting to a point where, you know, in the Fannie Mae environment, if I've got something that's maybe a C5 that's in below average condition, the productive use might be to remodel it. but we just need to clearly explain to our client accurately the condition of the property, and that remodeling sometimes is financially cost effective, sometimes it's not. But I think we need to clearly explain to our client the situation so they can then make that determination: is this a loan I want to make or not?
All right, let's tie this together a little bit tighter. So we've come up with the highest and best use, and you mentioned earlier that the highest and best use was foundational. That wasn't your word; that's my word, but that's what you meant. The highest and best use was foundational to the value opinion. So we've come up with a value opinion of $350,000 or whatever it is. So let's relate this first of all to the cost approach. Now, how does the highest and best use form a part of the cost approach? And how does doing the cost approach, as odious as that may sound, but how does engaging in the protocols of the cost approach help us determine the property's highest and best use?
Well, like I think you have implied, is the cost approach is one of these approaches that many residential appraisers try to avoid. And yet it can be one of the really good tools in helping us determine if a property's meeting the test of highest and best use. And essentially, if I can develop an appropriate land value or site value, and that's where I see the biggest weakness on the appraisals I see where cost approaches are done. People are making up the land value. If you're doing that, then your cost approach doesn't help you very much.
You mean you're not supposed to?
Yeah, well, I've determined that extraction, when I read in a report that says I develop my site value by extraction, extraction means I'm grabbing the value out of the air and putting it in there. And because often, I rarely see an appraisal where somebody's done a cost approach and they've actually told me how they got there. And that's foundational. But if I have got a reliable land value, the cost approach is going to tell me, do my improvements contribute value? And if they do, that helps me meet the test of highest and best use.
So from a standpoint of indicating a value, the cost approach probably isn't all that special. But from a standpoint of a tool for calculating depreciation, for measuring the financial feasibility of the improvements, et cetera, then the highest and best use and the cost approach are interrelated, because the cost approach helps determine the feasibility of any proposed or existing improvements. Is that what you mean?
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And I think the thing that we sometimes forget with the cost approach is that and USPAP specifically spells this out, is that the measure of obsolescence is the critical component. And USPAP will tell you that in measuring obsolescence is the difference between the cost of the improvements new and their present worth. And a lot of people complain, well, gee, I'm just backing into it at that point. And the answer is yes, you are. But the measure of obsolescence can be a critical tool in helping me determine the contributory value of the improvements. And so if I know that my improvements have 50% obsolescence from replacement cost new, it then helps me to determine how to analyze and adjust comparable sales based on similar, that have similar improvements. I know they're not replacement cost new, it's something less than that, and this kind of helps me model that in such a way that it can make sense. And we find many of your county assessors that are doing their mass modeling use some kind of a modified version of that in an effort to try to determine the mass value for property taxes.
So basically what you're saying is that the data you develop in the cost approach could help you set adjustments in the sales comparison approach?
Yeah, I think it's a really good tool in doing that. The thing that just cracks me up is I will see appraisers who go develop a cost approach, and in their cost approach, they've got depreciation in there. And by the way, straight line depreciation and cost approach doesn't work very well. But if they've got this number in there, hold on. They've got this number in there, and it says $50,000 in depreciation, and yet they're adjusting the comparable sales at $500 a year, when their cost approach is telling them that the obsolescence is $3,000 or $4,000 a year. And so it can actually help me develop adjustments for age and other things that we oftentimes fail to look at and consider in trying to analyze our comparable sales.
Now, I'm going to throw a curveball at you here. And remember, Craig, we're friends. Okay. Now, you go out and you're doing an appraisal in an upscale neighborhood. And you find that there are a few more than typical properties and they're being held for rent. You know, people have bought them. They're in their late, or they're in their late 50s, maybe early 60s. They haven't quite retired yet, but they're going to, and until they do, they're renting the property out to let somebody else cover the mortgage and the expenses for them. But one of the things you find is that unless there is a really significant difference in the quality of the house, that a house with a pool rents for $1,500 a month, and a house without a pool rents for $1,500 a month. So what you're seeing is, all of the things being equal, a pool doesn't add any value given the fact that they both rent for the same amount. Yet you go and you say, well, the highest and best use of the property, if it were vacant today, would be to develop what's there. But yet your income approach just showed you that the pool wasn't worth anything because it didn't generate any rent. So how is that? I mean, if the appraiser were to say, yep, highest and best use would be to build a house that's there today, including the pool that doesn't generate any value, does that really make any sense from a standpoint of both internal consistency and the theory of highest and best use?
You know, I think the biggest problem we have as appraisers is that we don't put enough comments in the report, you know, analysis comments. So it would be perfectly appropriate in that situation. And in that scenario, it presumes that the highest and best use is to rent the property out. We will occasionally find situations where the property will sell for more as a residential property than what the income would justify, because people's motivations for the property is not for income. It's just an interim use until they retire into the place, in which case the analysis might break down a little bit on the pool contributory value. But and I might have sales data that says, well, the pool's contributing a little bit of value. I'm just not picking it up on rent. So renting the property may not be income. People buy the property for income, so that may not be the most compelling way to analyze that. But in the event that the pool makes no contributory value to the improvements, it's appropriate to say, yeah, the pool's probably a super adequacy. It's a preference. Some people like them, some people don't. You get into cold climates, and the pool can be a liability because people are saying, gee, it costs a lot to maintain these. And if you've ever owned a pool, which I do, and you go replace the plaster on that, replace the heating and cooling system, or the circulation and the heating system, you're looking at a lot of money. And in some cases, I've had a situation where the cost to go maintain this thing was about the contributory value of the pool. And I'm going, do I want to dump 10 grand into this thing, or 15,000 into this, go plaster it and replace the mechanical system associated with it? And my wife said yes, so we did. But
well, you're married. You knew there was no issue whatsoever. You do what you're told. Yeah.
The grandkids are going to come and visit us because we got the pool, so we're going to fix it.
We're going to fix the pool. Yeah. Okay. That makes perfect sense to me. I understand that. Okay. So let's, without going into a 2 or 3 day class, we've covered highest and best use about as deeply as we can in this kind of a format. Is there anything else on your mind that we need to know about?
Well, we live in an interesting time, and I think we spent enough time chatting that I hate to go off any kind of a tangent, but I think it's going to be interesting. I own a couple of office buildings, and I'm a little worried about highest and best use of office space if this remote working is going to have an adverse impact on lease rates and occupancy on office space, because a lot of people have discovered they can work from home. The thing that I've discovered is people who are working from home are not quite as efficient as when they're in their office environment. So I don't know. It's going to be an interesting thing to see.
So what you're saying is, you as a landlord, not as an appraiser, but as a landlord, are finding that maybe you're going to be looking at some higher vacancy rates and or lower income rates and or higher expenses.
I think that's a possibility. I'd seen a article how Manhattan is really struggling right now on the commercial on their commercial spaces there, because they've had so many people vacate to the suburbs to work remotely, that it's putting a little financial stress on the Wall Street commercial office space, where people don't have to physically be there. And I think that's a trend. I'm aware of other people in places like San Francisco that have fled to the suburbs to go live with mom and dad or somebody else, and working remotely and making a trip into the office, once or twice a month. And it might have a impact on what happens with commercial real estate, and it might have an impact on some of these really high-priced urban properties, where people are deciding that I don't have to be right downtown to do my work.
Interesting. And we'll be seeing I don't want, fallout's the wrong word. We'll be seeing the results of that as time goes on. Well, Craig, thank you. I appreciate that. We will continue our conversations, because they are quite interesting given your background and your training, and the fact that you work in 3 states, Utah, Arizona, and Nevada, and therefore you get a really big picture of what's going on. And so until the next time, I look forward to it. My best to you and all of yours. And again, happy birthday.
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate it. Always a pleasure. Look forward to visiting again.